My name is Isabella Vargas. I'm 32 years old. I'm an art director at a design agency in Denver, Colorado. And this morning, the safe, orderly world it took me 20 years to build nearly collapsed on my kitchen counter. My coffee went cold in my hands as I stared at my phone screen, completely frozen. The device kept vibrating against the marble, over and over, emitting a low buzz that drilled into my nerves. 29 missed calls. 29. And all of them came from an Illinois area code I had tried to erase from my mind with the same urgency one uses to cut poison out of their body. Before I even opened the voicemail, before I read the first message, my body already knew what my mind refused to accept. The physical panic was instant. A cold sweat ran down my neck, my breathing turned shallow, and I felt that old, familiar knot of terror in the pit of my stomach. Some memories don't fade with time. They don't heal on their own. They simply lie in wait in the darkest corners of your mind, patiently waiting for an ordinary Tuesday to leap at your throat and drag you back into hell. For me, all it took was a sound, a blinking area code on a glass screen, to turn me back into that small, terrified girl with no escape. To understand the weight of those 29 calls, you need to understand where I come from. I grew up in Willow Creek, an affluent suburb of Illinois where appearances didn't just matter, they were the only true religion. To our neighbors and the community, the Vargas name was synonymous with success, unshakable values, and the classic American dream. My parents owned a thriving and exclusive chain of high-end furniture and decor stores. Their business was literally selling the illusion of the perfect home. Flawless leather sofas where happy families supposedly rested, solid oak tables for laughter-filled dinners, and designer lamps that bathed everything in a warm, artificial glow. Our public life was an extension of that catalog. On weekends, my father grilled in the backyard, wearing a rehearsed smile of a benevolent patriarch. My mother greeted neighbors over the white fence, her hair always perfectly styled and her clothes immaculate. They sponsored the local team, hosted charity dinners. People pointed to them as the gold standard of parenting, but that was the performance. The real show, the one of absolute horror, began the moment the heavy oak door of our home closed and the guests left. My mother wasn't just a strict woman, she was a masterful actress, an emotional predator disguised as a lady of society. Her greatest art was manipulation. She had the astonishing and chilling ability to preside over a school committee with sweetness in the morning and transform into a relentless psychological tormentor by night. Within our four walls, love did not exist as a birthright. It was a reward, conditional on perfect performance that was never quite enough. She didn't need to raise her voice to destroy. She used a soft, almost clinical tone to inject the poison. If I cried, she looked at me with disgust and called me pathetic. If I asked for help with homework, she punished me for being a useless burden. Any normal childhood mistake was twisted into an excuse for what she, with a cold smile, called her life lessons. She justified every humiliation under the claim that she was toughening me for the real world. And my father was her most devoted accomplice. He never defended me. On the contrary, he backed every act of cruelty with a twisted laugh, as if breaking his own daughter's spirit were a sport, a private form of entertainment only the two of them were clever enough to enjoy. For the Vargas family, cruelty wasn't a flaw. It was their language. That brutal contrast between the perfect mother in public and the monster behind closed doors taught me early on to live in a constant state of hypervigilance. My own home was a minefield where survival depended on reading the level of boredom or frustration in my mother's eyes. I thought I had left that house, and that fear, buried forever. But as I stared at the 29 notifications on my phone this morning, I realized the most terrifying lesson of all. You can change your name. You can run thousands of miles away. You can build a beautiful life from scratch. But the past doesn't always stay where you bury it. Sometimes, when it runs out of options, it comes looking for you. People tend to think that child abuse always leaves visible marks. They believe in the stereotype of uncontrolled shouting, broken plates, and bruises on the skin. But my parents were too intelligent and too cowardly to leave that kind of evidence. Their violence was invisible, meticulously calculated, and worst of all, always disguised as virtue. My mother loved the word lesson. She used it like a scalpel. At 8 years old, I made the mistake of asking for new sneakers during a shopping trip at the mall. Mine were literally worn through at the toes, exposing my socks. My mother stopped abruptly, looked me up and down as if I had demanded a diamond necklace, and grabbed my arm tightly. She dragged me to an isolated bench near the busy food court. "If you want to live in the real world, Isabella, you're going to learn that no one owes you anything. Sit here and reflect on your selfishness," she whispered in her usual icy tone. Then they left. They left me sitting there for nearly 3 hours. I remember the smell of cinnamon and butter from a nearby pretzel stand mixing with the absolute terror crushing my chest. I didn't cry because I already knew my tears were fuel for their amusement. When they finally came back, carrying bags from luxury stores, my father looked at my mother and laughed. "Do you owe me $20, dear?" I bet the useless girl would stay in the exact same spot, too scared to move. There was no hug, no new shoes, just the echo of their mockery ringing in my childhood ears. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Over the years, it only became more sophisticated. At 9, I experienced what I now recognize as pure psychological torture. It was the middle of winter in Illinois, the kind of cold where the wind cuts your skin like shards of glass. I walked home from school, and when I reached the porch, I realized I had lost my house key. Trembling, I knocked on the door. My mother opened it, saw that I didn't have it, and her face turned into that mask of absolute coldness that froze me more than the weather. "Actions have consequences," she said calmly. "Today you will learn to be responsible for your things." Then she closed the heavy door and locked it from the inside. I stayed on the porch, wrapped in a thin coat, silently begging. Through the large living room window, I could see them perfectly. My father lit the fireplace. My mother poured 2 glasses of red wine. They sat there, warm and comfortable, drinking, talking, and occasionally looking at me through the glass while I froze outside. They watched my suffering with the same detached curiosity a scientist uses to observe an insect struggling in a jar. They left me there until my lips turned blue and I could no longer feel my toes. When they finally opened the door, my father patted my frozen head and said, "I bet you won't lose your key again, right, champ?" By the time I was 10, empathy felt like a foreign concept. One day after a school sports game, I broke down crying in the parking lot because older kids had shoved and mocked me. A normal parent would have comforted their child. Mine looked at each other in disappointment. My mother ordered me into the car without a word. My father drove angrily to the darkest, most isolated corner of the massive stadium parking lot. He stopped the car, turned off the engine, and my mother turned toward me. "Tears make you weak, Isabella, and weakness attracts predators. Learn to swallow your crying, or stay here until you grow up." They forced me out of the car and drove away, leaving me surrounded by darkness. I sat on a cold concrete curb, hugging my knees under the dim flicker of a street lamp, terrified of every shadow, watching the place empty out completely. An hour and a half later, the car returned. They were eating fast food. The smell of fries filled the car as I climbed back in, shaking. No apology, not even food for me. My father smiled while chewing and said, "I thought you might try hitchhiking. You're more cowardly than I expected." Everything was a test. Everything was a cruel joke at my expense. The most twisted part of my childhood wasn't the constant fear. It was how proud they were of their methods. They used grand words to disguise disgusting acts. They talked about building character and creating resilience. If anyone had asked them, they would have sworn they were raising a strong woman. But they weren't building independence. They were cultivating chronic terror. To survive, I learned not to exist. I learned to walk without making a sound, to read the tension in my father's shoulders from behind, to predict my mother's outbursts by the way she set her keys on the counter. I became a ghost in my own home, my only refuge, the only place where they couldn't control the rules, was paper. I began drawing obsessively, in the margins of school notebooks, on the backs of old bills, in cheap sketch pads I bought in secret. I drew birds flying high, trains racing through the night, rooms with reinforced doors that only opened from the inside. I didn't know it back then, but through those desperate strokes, my child's mind was trying to draw an escape route. A route that, very soon, through the most brutal and traumatic way possible, I would be forced to take. The event that triggered the final destruction of my family wasn't some great act of rebellion on my part, nor a public scandal. Everything exploded over something ridiculously small. It was about a grade. At 12 years old, I got a B+ in art class. I hadn't failed math or flunked science. It was just a B+ in the only subject that made me feel alive. I came home proud of my small achievement, but when my mother saw the report card, she held it between her fingertips as if it were an infected rag. Her face twisted into a mask of deep disappointment. "How is it possible that you spend so many hours scribbling nonsense and still can't achieve excellence in the one thing you supposedly care about?" she asked with surgical coldness. My father, sipping his whiskey from the couch, added, "Maybe the girl is getting lazy. Or worse, she thinks mediocre effort is enough." That night, hidden in my room with the lights off, I heard them murmuring in the kitchen. My mother said, "She needs a lesson that will remove that complacency forever." And my father replied, "I'd bet money on it." The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was disturbingly cheerful. My mother made pancakes. My father even asked if I had slept well. They announced we were taking a day trip to Chicago, just the three of us, to spend quality time as a family. For one stupid, desperate, pathetic second, my 12-year-old mind wanted to believe them. I thought maybe they had regretted it. Maybe this was their strange way of apologizing for the night before. I should have known. Devils don't apologize. The drive from Willow Creek to the city was suffocating. My father blasted the radio and tapped the steering wheel with unnatural enthusiasm. My mother, from the passenger seat, kept turning around to ask me questions loaded with poison disguised as curiosity. "Do you consider yourself a smart girl, Isabella? Do you think smart girls are ready to face the real world alone? Do you think the world cares if you're afraid?" I answered in short, trembling responses, my heart pounding against my ribs. Every time I tried to stay silent, they pressed harder. The air inside the car was thick. My entire body was on high alert, screaming that something terrible was about to happen and that I would have no way to defend myself. We arrived at Chicago's Union Station around noon. I had never been in a place so massive, so loud, and so overwhelming. With its towering vaulted ceilings and enormous windows, the station felt like an entire city compressed under one roof. The echo of thousands of footsteps, the rumble of rolling suitcases, the incomprehensible announcements over loudspeakers, the smell of cheap coffee, damp wool, and train ozone. It was a full assault on my senses. People rushed past me, businessmen in suits, tourist families, college students. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. I, on the other hand, felt microscopic, a single invisible point in an ocean of movement. I stayed glued to my parents, terrified of losing them in the crowd. In the main hall, my mother stopped abruptly, pointed to a massive marble column near the glass entrance doors, and looked down at me. "Wait for us right here," she ordered firmly. "Your father and I are going to move the car to a cheaper parking lot and grab something quick to eat. 15 minutes, maybe 20. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten. "Can I come with you?" I whispered. My father let out a loud laugh, loud enough to make a few people turn around. "You're 12, Isabella, not 2. Don't be ridiculous," he mocked. My mother leaned in close enough for me to smell her expensive floral perfume and hissed, "Don't move from this column, and for the love of God, don't embarrass me by making a scene in public." I nodded frantically. I pressed myself against the cold marble as I watched them walk toward the doors, blending into the crowd until they disappeared. And then the countdown to my destruction began. I watched the giant station clock obsessively. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. At first, my child's mind tried to rationalize it. There's traffic, I told myself. The line for food is long. They got lost. But when the clock hit 1 full hour, the physical pain of panic took over. Sharp pains stabbed my chest. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled so badly I had to shove them into my jacket pockets. I had exactly $9 with me, no phone, no address, no idea how trains worked or how to leave that city of steel and concrete. I would take 3 steps away from the column and run back, terrified they might return at that exact second and punish me for disobeying. The noise of the station became deafening. Every announcement made me jump. Every brown-haired woman in the distance made me lift my head in hope, only to feel a stab of disappointment seconds later. Every minute stretched into unbearable agony. Then it happened. Through the massive glass windows at the entrance, I saw my father's unmistakable black SUV slowly gliding down the street outside. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. A nervous laugh escaped my throat. They're back! They came back! I thought, running toward the glass and waving both arms desperately. But the car didn't stop. It kept moving slowly along the curb lane. I pressed myself against the cold glass. I saw them clearly. My father behind the wheel, my mother in the passenger seat, both of them looking directly at me. My father smiled first, and it wasn't the relieved smile of a parent who finds their lost child. It was a twisted, satisfied smile, the kind a prankster has when watching their victim fall perfectly into the trap. The car slowed even more. The passenger window began to roll down. My mother leaned out, her perfectly styled face glowing under the Chicago sunlight. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted at the top of her lungs over the traffic noise. Her voice pierced through the glass and burned itself into my soul. I bet $50 you're too useless to find your way home on your own. Then she laughed. A clean, bright, genuinely amused laugh. My father laughed with her, lifted one hand from the wheel, looked me straight in the eyes through the glass, and gave me a thumbs up, a grotesque gesture of victory. The next second, the window rolled up, the engine roared, and the black SUV sped away, disappearing into the sea of taxis and buses. I stood there, frozen, my palms pressed against the glass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't blink. The world around me lost all sound. It's one thing to fear your parents forgot you by accident. It's another to suspect they're teaching you a harsh lesson. But what shattered my mind in that moment was understanding the absolute truth. My fear wasn't a side effect of their methods. My fear, my pure, absolute terror, was the goal. It was the joke. It was their entertainment. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally stepped back, the afternoon had begun to fade. The sky outside shifted from blue to gray, then to a heavy black. With a deep electrical hum that seemed to vibrate the ground, thousands of artificial lights flickered on across the station's ceiling. That sound, the click of the lights turning on, was the sound of hope dying. That was the exact moment everything changed. I was no longer a child waiting for her parents to come back. The waiting was over. The abandonment had officially begun, and at 12 years old, realizing that the only two people in the world who are supposed to protect you have thrown you to the wolves for fun, feels exactly like falling off a cliff into total darkness. Surviving the next 3 hours inside Union Station was like walking along the ocean floor without oxygen. I wandered aimlessly through the vast corridors, staying away from the exits out of fear of getting even more lost in the city, yet also keeping my distance from information desks and security guards. Anyone in their right mind might ask, why didn't a 12-year-old girl, alone and abandoned, immediately run to find a police officer? The answer to that question is the most twisted and destructive part of psychological abuse. My parents had trained me for years to distrust the entire world. They had instilled in me the absolute belief that if I caused problems, authority figures would punish me even more harshly than they did. They taught me that asking for help was an unforgivable sign of weakness. Today, psychologists call it traumatic conditioning, a kind of Stockholm syndrome. My captors had left the door open, but they had built such a perfect prison inside my own mind that I refused to walk through it. I preferred silent panic and the gnawing pain of hunger over the fury of my mother if she found out I had embarrassed her by asking for help. That is the true victory of an abuser, getting the victim to protect their tormentor even while being destroyed by them. The person who finally broke that twisted spell didn't wear a shiny badge or a uniform of authority. She wore a simple janitor's vest. Her name was Carmen. She was a woman in her 50s, with rough hands but deeply kind eyes. Apparently, she had seen me pass by the same row of vending machines over and over again, dragging my feet, my face streaked with tears I kept trying to wipe away on my sleeves. She gently stepped into my path near a side corridor and, in a soft voice, almost a whisper, asked if I was lost. My first instinct, of course, was to protect my monsters. I lied immediately. I lifted my chin, imitating my mother's cold arrogance, and said in a trembling voice that, no, I was just waiting for my parents, who had gone to park the car. Carmen didn't look at me with pity, but with a sharp understanding that completely disarmed me. "How long have you been waiting for them, my child?" she asked, glancing at the darkness already settling beyond the windows. I told her I didn't know. Then she asked the question that shattered every wall I had built to survive. "Have you eaten anything since this morning?" The knot in my throat broke so violently it felt like physical pain in my chest. I began sobbing so hard I could barely stay on my feet. All the shame, terror, and humiliation I had been swallowing poured out uncontrollably. I told her everything. The words spilled out like emotional vomit. I told her they had left me on purpose. I described the car window rolling down, the $50 bet, my mother's laughter, my father's thumbs up. Any other adult in my old life would have told me to calm down or accused me of being dramatic. Carmen did neither. She slowly knelt down until her face was level with mine, took my freezing hands in her warm ones, and said the most revolutionary words I had ever heard in my life. "You're safe now, Isabella. I believe you. And I promise no one is going to hurt you again." Within minutes, station security called transit police. They took me to a small administrative office. They gave me a bottle of water and a packet of crackers because my hands were shaking so badly from low blood sugar that I could barely hold them. While one officer took my statement, another went to review the security cameras at the main entrance. That detail changed everything. They checked the footage, and there it was. The truth, in black and white, undeniable. The cameras confirmed that I had been standing by the column for hours. They confirmed that a black SUV matching my family's vehicle had slowed down, stopped briefly in front of me without any intention of parking, and then sped away into traffic. It wasn't the imagination of a frightened child. It was hard evidence. When they finally managed to contact my parents by phone, using the business number of one of their furniture stores, the silence in the office became suffocating. I sat there, small in a chair too big for me, curled in on myself. I could hear half the conversation through the officer holding the phone. I will never forget the transformation in that officer's face. It shifted from routine professionalism to absolute disbelief, and finally to complete disgust. My parents, true to their endless arrogance, weren't denying it. They were admitting it. They were justifying themselves, using their usual rhetoric about teaching life lessons and building character. The officer listened in silence, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. Then his voice cut through the room like a blade. "Are you telling me you are not on your way to pick her up? That you are at home, hours away?" There was a pause as my mother responded. The officer straightened, his posture radiating the full authority of his badge. "No, ma'am. Listen very carefully, because I will only say this once. Leaving a 12-year-old child abandoned in one of the largest and most dangerous transit stations in the country is not a lesson in independence. It is a serious criminal offense of child abandonment and reckless endangerment. And if you do not present yourselves in this jurisdiction to answer for this, I will issue an arrest warrant in your county tonight." A chill ran down my spine. For the first time in my life, Someone had told my parents that what they were doing was not parenting, it was a crime. Their grand justifications had just crashed against the immovable wall of the law. That same night, an emergency social worker arrived at the station. She explained that because my parents continued insisting that this had been a parenting decision, the state would intervene immediately to protect me. I would not be going home. I would be placed in temporary foster care until a court reviewed the case. As they put me into a car to take me to a stranger's home in the middle of the night, I looked out the window at the blurred lights of Chicago. I was terrified, yes, but beneath that fear, the empire of terror the Vargas family had built was beginning to crumble, and for the first time, I was out of their reach. The first few days under the roof of Mateo and Lucia Cruz, my emergency foster family, were like waking up on a planet with a completely different gravity. I lived in a state of perpetual alert, waiting for the guillotine to fall. If Lucia told me she was going to the supermarket and would be back in 20 minutes, I would spend 19 minutes standing by the window, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I would never see her again. If I dropped a fork on the floor during dinner, I would squeeze my eyes shut, hunching my shoulders in anticipation of a scream or a punishment. But the punishment never came. Mateo, a soft-spoken photographer with hands stained by film developer, would simply pick up the fork, smile at me, and say, "It's just metal, Isabella. It's okay." Lucia never entered my room without knocking gently and waiting for my permission. That simple act, absolute respect for my space and my fear, seemed like incomprehensible magic to me. They were teaching me, minute by minute, that cruelty was not the natural state of the world. However, the true battlefield, the place where the fate of my soul would be decided, was not that house filled with light. It was a government building of cold concrete and sterile hallways in downtown Chicago, the family court. On the day of the preliminary hearing, my parents made their grand entrance. They didn't arrive with bowed heads or tears of regret. They arrived flanked by a lawyer in a custom suit that cost more than a social worker's annual salary. My mother wore an impeccable navy blue power suit, pearl earrings, and perfectly coiffed hair, as if the respectability of her wardrobe could wash away the fact that she had thrown her daughter away like trash at a train station. My father walked with his chin high, emanating the aura of a busy businessman dealing with an annoying traffic ticket. The most grotesque part of the entire legal process was their absolute inability to feel shame. Before the judge, an older man with a granite gaze who seemed immune to expensive suits, my parents denied nothing. They admitted everything with a pride that turned my blood cold. Their lawyer tried to soften the words, but my mother interrupted him to declare to the court that they were simply building resilience in a spoiled girl. My father, crossing his arms and leaning back in his chair, added that modern society was raising weaklings and that they were doing the hard work no one else wanted to do. I sat a few meters away, flanked by my social worker, listening to them. And in that instant, a terrifying clarity descended upon me. They were never going to change. If they had a single drop of maternal or paternal instinct, the sight of their daughter trembling in a courtroom would have destroyed them. But they were only annoyed by the inconvenience. The final blow came when the court-appointed therapist stood up to read the psychological evaluation. The document was a living autopsy of the Vargas family. The professional described a systematic pattern of acute emotional abuse, calculated humiliation, reckless negligence, and pathological narcissism. He explained step by step how the station incident wasn't a lesson gone wrong, but the climax of psychological torture designed to break my spirit and feed my parents' egos. Hearing those words echo in a court of law was the most cathartic experience of my life. For the first time, the monster had an official name. The guilt, that heavy shadow I had carried for years believing I was a bad daughter, vanished. It wasn't me, it was them. The judge struck the bench with his gavel, silencing the indignant murmurs of my father's lawyer. He looked at my parents with barely contained contempt and delivered the ultimatum that would define the rest of my existence. He explained that, given the circumstances, the state would not return me to their home that night. However, the law required offering a family reunification plan, If they wanted to regain custody, they had to undergo a strict 2-year program. This included mandatory parenting classes, weekly intensive psychiatric therapy, court-supervised visits, and undergoing surprise home inspections. They had to prove, under the government's magnifying glass, that they were fit to raise a human being. The second option, the judge said, lowering his voice until it became a scalpel, was the voluntary and permanent termination of their parental rights. The silence that followed was so thick it could almost be cut. I watched my father's profile. I saw the vein in his neck throb with fury. For a man who had built an empire based on absolute control and public image, the idea of being evaluated, judged, and re-educated by state bureaucrats was an unforgivable affront. The idea of sitting in a therapy circle admitting his flaws was infinitely more repulsive to him than the idea of losing his own blood. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the polished floor. No half-baked psychologist is going to come into my house and tell me how to raise my daughter, my father spat, his mask of respectability falling to reveal the raw rage beneath. I will not subject myself to this public humiliation to satisfy a court. If the state thinks it's so capable of raising an ungrateful girl, keep her. I turned my head toward my mother, hoping, deep in my wounded childhood heart, that she would stop him, that she would cry, that she would say I was worth the effort. My mother didn't even look at me. She simply straightened the cuff of her jacket, nodded toward her lawyer, and said in a monotone voice, "Where do we sign to end this circus?" They chose their pride, just like that. In a matter of 15 minutes, they signed the legal documents that severed every biological and legal tie to me. The sound of their pens scratching the paper is something I still hear in my nightmares. My chest didn't explode in tears. My entire body went paralyzed, submerged in absolute stillness. I had spent my whole life trying to crack the code to be loved by them, trying to be perfect, useful, invisible, whatever was necessary so they wouldn't hurt me. And in the end, they handed me over to the state like someone returning a defective piece of furniture to a store. That is the most brutal truth I learned at 12 years old. I didn't lose my family because the system snatched me from their arms. I lost them because they opened their hands and let me fall so they wouldn't stain their suits. But as I watched them walk out of the courtroom, heads held high, never looking back once, I knew another even greater truth. By signing that paper, they thought they were punishing me. They didn't know that, in reality, they had just signed my Declaration of Liberation. Healing does not happen in a straight line, and it definitely doesn't look like a cinematic montage where the rescued child magically flourishes in their new home. The reality of trauma is much darker and more persistent. Despite finally being safe, my nervous system continued to live in a trench. During the first few years with Matteo and Lucia, my body reacted to kindness as if it were a death trap about to snap shut. The invisible scars of abuse dictated my every move. If I heard the screech of tires from a car braking suddenly on the street, my breath would catch and my hands would go numb. If we were at a mall and Lucia told me that cursed phrase, "I'll be right back, wait for me here," panic would rise up my throat like acid. I hated waiting in public places. I hated being the center of attention. I hated depending on anyone. The brilliance of the Cruzes, my new family, didn't lie in grand heroic gestures, but in their unwavering consistency. They never demanded that I love them. They never asked for gratitude for saving me. They simply stayed. When the adoption was finalized a couple of years later, the judge asked if I wanted to change my name. I didn't hesitate for a millisecond. The scared girl the Vargases had left at that station died that cold day in Chicago. I renounced the name those monsters had given me and chose to call myself Isabella, Isabella Cruz. That name belonged only to me. It was a blank canvas. I filled that canvas, literally, with art. Matteo, being a photographer, quickly noticed my compulsive obsession with drawing on any scrap of paper I could find. One random Tuesday, without making a big speech, he left a professional sketchbook and a set of charcoal pencils on my bed. That was my true therapy. Art became my voice when trauma left me mute. Drawing was the only tangible proof that I was capable of creating something beautiful in a world that had taught me I was only a nuisance. Years later, against all odds, I was accepted into the Art Institute of Chicago. Returning to the city that had been the stage for my worst nightmare was not a coincidence, it was an act of conquest. The same city where I was abandoned became the place where I built the foundations of my career. I specialized in graphic design and visual identity. It was almost a poetic irony. I had spent my entire childhood trapped in the lies and false appearances of my biological parents, and now my work consisted of helping people communicate their true essence honestly. But the geography of Illinois still stifled me. There were too many ghosts. Upon graduating, I took a job at an agency in Denver, Colorado. I needed fresh air, mountains, physical distance. Denver gave me the space to breathe without looking over my shoulder. I opened my own studio, gained loyal clients, and for the first time, felt that life was not a battlefield. That was when I met Diego. We were introduced at a dinner with friends. Diego was a software engineer. He had an inherent calm, a solidity that didn't feel forced or acted. Unlike the loud men who tried to dominate every room, he listened. On our third date, I warned him that my family history was complicated. On the fifth, I gave him a few vague details. Months later, on a winter night, I finally gathered the courage to tell him the full story. I told him about the humiliations, the $50 bet, the black SUV driving away at Union Station, and my parents' decision in court. As I spoke, I mentally prepared for the worst. I expected him to give me one of those toxic positivity speeches about how everything happens for a reason, or pain makes you stronger. Diego did none of that. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't try to find a silver lining in the cruelty. He simply looked me in the eyes, slid his hand across the table to take mine, and said in a voice both firm and broken, "That should never have happened to you, Isabella." The simplicity and absolute validation of those words nearly disarmed me completely. He didn't want to fix me, he just wanted to walk beside me. We built our life with the same patience with which I had rebuilt myself. We married in an intimate ceremony. Mateo walked me down the aisle, and Lucia adjusted my veil, crying out of pure happiness. We adopted a mixed-breed dog named Max, who had a notched ear and the cautious gaze of someone who had also been abandoned too soon. I blocked every possible avenue of contact from my biological family, social media, old emails, everything. I even changed my phone number when moving to Colorado. I managed to build a wonderfully ordinary and peaceful life. Dinners with friends, morning walks with Max, professional success, a marriage full of respect. A life so whole and secure that I came to convince myself the monsters of Willow Creek had ceased to exist. Until this morning. Until the frantic vibration of my phone broke the silence of my kitchen and the screen lit up with those 29 missed calls from Illinois. The past had found a crack in my fortress, and it was breaking down the door. I stood petrified in front of the kitchen counter, the phone vibrating in my hand as if it were about to explode. Diego, seeing the blood drain from my face, slowly approached and put a hand on my shoulder. Max, our dog, whimpered, sensing the tension in the air. When call number 29 finally ceased, it gave way to a voicemail notification. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. I prepared myself to hear my mother's icy voice or my father's authoritative tone, but the voice that filled the silence of my kitchen belonged to neither of them. It was a woman's voice, raspy, tired, burdened with the weight of 1,000 lost battles. "Isabella, it's Elena. I know you have every reason in the world to delete this message, but I beg you to listen. I'm not calling to ask for favors. I'm calling because the house of cards has finally collapsed, and I thought you deserved to know from someone who wouldn't lie to you. Elena, my younger sister. The last time I saw her, she was a little girl in mismatched socks who followed me through the hallways of that oppressive house, too young to understand why the air was always so tense when our parents were around. During the next 5 minutes, as the voicemail played on, I listened to the story of a downfall so absolute and devastating that it seemed ripped from a Greek tragedy. The Vargas Empire, that perfect facade of wealth, status, and morality that my parents had sacrificed their eldest daughter to protect, had been reduced to ashes. And most poetically, most terrifyingly just of all, they weren't destroyed by me. They were destroyed by their own arrogance. Elena told me it all began a couple of years ago with a simple internet comment. My mother, in an act of hypocrisy bordering on delusion, had responded to a post in a Willow Creek community Facebook group. The original post was from a young mother asking for parenting advice. My mother, unable to contain her need for superiority, wrote a long paragraph criticizing the current generation, claiming children needed strict discipline and a firm hand, and boasting about her traditional methods. That comment was the spark that ignited the powder keg. A retired former county court clerk, with nothing left to lose, read the comment. Outraged by my mother's audacity, she replied publicly, suggesting that a woman who had lost custody of her eldest daughter for abandonment had no right to give moral lessons. Chaos broke loose. The rumors that for years had been only whispers behind closed doors exploded in full view. Former employees of their furniture stores began speaking out about the workplace abuse they suffered. Old neighbors recalled disturbing details. My parents' public image, that deity they worshipped, collapsed in a matter of weeks. The Willow Creek community, which had once revered them, devoured them alive with the same gossip and cruelty they used to preach. Customers stopped going to their exclusive furniture stores, preferring to drive extra miles to other towns rather than give them a cent. Social clubs closed their doors to them. Bankruptcy followed soon after. They lost everything: the stores, the mansion, the status. And as if the universe had decided to collect all debts at once, their bodies took their toll. Elena revealed, in a voice devoid of any filial emotion, that our father had suffered a severe stroke 6 months ago that left him partially paralyzed. My mother had been diagnosed with aggressive terminal cancer. Now they lived alone in a small government-subsidized apartment on the outskirts of town. Alone, sick, broke, and despised by the very society they tried so hard to impress. But that's not the whole truth, Isabella. Elena continued in the recording, her voice cracking for the first time. I also cut off all contact with them a year ago. I grew up hearing their version of the story. They told me the state had exaggerated, that the social workers had manipulated you, that you were a rebellious child. But when I had my own son, something clicked. I requested the court records of your case. I read them all. I read the psychological report. I read about the train station. There was a deathly silence on the line, followed by a stifled sob. I looked at my baby sleeping in his crib, my sister whispered, and I realized I was raised by monsters. I never let them near my son again. They are completely alone, Isabella. And the reason they are looking for you now, the reason for all those calls, isn't because they've repented. It's because they are terrified. They are panicked about dying in misery and oblivion. They want the daughter they discarded to come back and take care of them. The message ended with an electronic beep. The kitchen fell into absolute silence. Diego looked at me, waiting for me to burst into tears, or rage, or a hysterical laugh of revenge. But I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I only felt a deep, ancient exhaustion, rooted in my bones. Diego stepped closer, wrapped his arms around me, and rested his chin on my head. You owe them nothing, he said firmly. You can delete the message, block the number, and never look back. No one will judge you. I closed my eyes, leaning my face against his chest. He was right. I could ignore them and let them drown in the poison they had distilled themselves. But as the image of that terrified 12-year-old girl at Union Station crossed my mind, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going back to save them. I wasn't going back to care for them. I was going back to look them in the eye and deliver, with my own voice, the final verdict.